every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The city of Perugia, in the heart of Umbria, feels eternal. It is a city of stone and shadow, built on a high hill, its Etruscan walls, still standing guard over streets that coil and climb like ancient vines. It is a place that lives and breathes its own history, where every cobblestone seems to hold a memory. By day, under the warm Italian sun, it is a city of breathtaking beauty, of soaring basilicas, bustling cafes, and sun-drenched piazzas where the chatter of students mixes with the tolling of church bells. But when night falls, especially in the damp chill of late autumn, Perugia transforms. The fog rolls in from the valleys, clinging to the medieval architecture, muffling sound, and turning the narrow, winding alleys into labyrinthine corridors of shadow and intrigue. The pale yellow light from wrought iron lamps casts long dancing figures on the ancient walls, and you can feel the weight of centuries in the air. It's a city where the past is not just remembered. It is an active, breathing presence, a silent character in every story that unfolds within its walls. It was into this intoxicating, almost theatrical setting that thousands of young people from around the world arrived each year, drawn to the prestigious University for Foreigners and the historic University of Perugia. They came to study art, history, and language, to live out a romantic, sun-drenched Italian dream. Far from the watchful eyes of their parents, in the autumn of 2007, this vibrant international community included a 21-year-old from London named Meredith Kercher and a 20-year-old from Seattle named Amanda Knox. They shared a small 4-bedroom cottage, a villetta, at number 7 Via della Pergola, a steep, quiet street just below the old city walls. Their lives were a vibrant, sometimes messy collage of new friendships, late-night gelato, weekend trips to Florence and Rome, and the universal anxieties and excitements of being young and far from home. It was a world of possibility, a fleeting, precious chapter of becoming. But on the 2nd of November, 2007, the day after the national holiday of All Saints' Day, that world was irrevocably, brutally shattered, inside the cottage on Via della Pergola, behind a locked bedroom door. Meredith Kercher was found dead. She had been sexually assaulted and her throat had been cut. The scene was one of brutal, intimate violence that seemed impossible in the quiet student flat, a savage intrusion of horror into a place of youthful aspiration. The ancient stones of Perugia, which had witnessed centuries of human drama, were now the silent audience to a modern tragedy, and as the Italian investigators, the Polizia di Stato, stepped across the threshold, they did not just enter a crime scene. They entered a hall of mirrors, a place where cultural perception, flawed science, prosecutorial ambition, and a ravenous global media would collide with devastating force. The investigation that followed would not uncover a simple truth. Instead, it would construct a narrative, a dark and lurid fantasy of diabolical rituals and erotic games gone wrong, a story worthy of the city's Gothic atmosphere. At the center of this narrative, they would place Meredith's American roommate, Amanda Knox. The world would come to know her not as a student, but as a caricature, a two-dimensional villainess given a tabloid nickname, Foxy Knoxy, the angel-faced she-devil. For nearly a decade, the case would wind its way through the labyrinth of the Italian justice system, a bewildering journey of convictions, acquittals, and reconvictions that captivated and horrified a global audience. The essential question of what happened to Meredith Kercher became hopelessly entangled with the more sensational question of who Amanda Knox was. Was she a cold, manipulative killer, a monster hiding in plain sight, or was she the innocent victim of a catastrophic, almost unbelievable, miscarriage of justice? Today, we are not here to simply retell a story you think you know. The headlines have long since faded. We are here to methodically dissect the anatomy of a legal and cultural collision. We will explore how the stark, fundamental differences between American and Italian justice, the immense power of a prosecutor's narrative, and the profound, insidious danger of cultural misunderstanding can combine to create a perfect storm, trapping individuals in a nightmare from which there seems to be no escape. This is the story of how a person can be convicted, not on evidence, but on perception, not for what they did, but for who they were imagined to be. To comprehend the scale of the tragedy that unfolded, you must first understand the people who were pulled into its vortex, and you must begin, always, with the victim, because in the sensationalism and the legal battles that followed, Meredith Kercher was too often reduced to a name, a beautiful face on a news report, the passive centerpiece of a mystery. She was so much more. Born and raised in South London, Meredith, known to her family and friends as Mez, was intelligent, driven, compassionate, and deeply loved. A student at the University of Leeds, she was studying European politics and Italian, and her year abroad in Perugia was the culmination of her academic ambitions and a testament to her adventurous spirit. She was described by everyone who knew her as a beacon of warmth and sensibility. She was witty, with a dry sense of humor, but also deeply caring. She had a tight-knit circle of British friends in Perugia, and spoke to her mother Arlene, back in England almost every day, sharing the small triumphs and frustrations of her new life. She was grounded, navigating her independence with a quiet confidence and maturity that belied her 21 years, in the cottage on Via della Pergola, which she shared with Amanda and two Italian women, Filomena Romanelli and Laura Mazzetti. Meredith was the anchor. She was the one who gently reminded her roommates to pay the utility bills or to keep up with the cleaning rota. She was focused on her studies, but also embraced the social life of Perugia, enjoying nights out with her friends. She was a daughter, a sister, and a loyal friend, a young woman with a future full of promise, a future that was stolen from her in the most horrific way imaginable. Her American roommate, Amanda Knox, was in many ways her temperamental opposite. Amanda arrived in Perugia from a middle-class, supportive family in Seattle, a world away both geographically and culturally. A student at the University of Washington majoring in linguistics, she was bright, athletic, and possessed a passion for creative writing and languages. But where Meredith was composed and poised, Amanda was exuberant, uninhibited, and at times endearingly awkward. Friends and family described her as a goofball, someone with a quirky sense of humor who might do cartwheels in a public place for no reason other than the sheer joy of it. Her high school soccer nickname, a playful jab at her speed and agility on the field, was Foxy Knoxy. It was a harmless, silly moniker that would later be unearthed by the British tabloids and twisted into something sinister, a ready-made brand for a femme fatale. Amanda was in Italy for the first time, wide-eyed and eager to soak in every experience. She was, by her own admission, naive about the world, and perhaps even more naive about how the world, particularly a world so different from her own, might perceive her. This naivety, this unself-conscious and sometimes clumsy way of being, would have catastrophic consequences. Just a week before the murder, On October 25, 2007, Amanda attended a classical music concert where she met Raffaele Solicito. He was a 23-year-old Italian computer engineering student. On the cusp of graduating from the University of Perugia, he was quiet, introspective, and studious. Known for his interest in manga and esoteric computer science, he came from a wealthy and respected family. His father was a prominent urologist in southern Italy. Raphael was captivated by the free-spirited, vivacious American girl. They embarked on a whirlwind romance, the kind that feels profound and all-consuming in its first, intoxicating days. They were inseparable, spending nearly all their time at his apartment, a short walk from the cottage. They watched movies, listened to music, smoked marijuana, and became wrapped up in the private hermetic bubble of new love. It was this intense, very public new relationship that would place them both together at the center of the impending storm. And then there was Rudy Guide. His story is the dark, tragic undercurrent to this narrative, the one piece of the puzzle that was, from the beginning, rooted in undeniable, horrifying fact. Rudy Herman Guide was born in the Ivory Coast and moved to Perugia with his father when he was a boy. After his father returned to Africa, he was effectively abandoned and was raised for a time by a local Italian family who tried to give him a stable home. But his life was one of instability, displacement, and petty crime. He was known to the other students in the circle, including the young men who lived in the downstairs flat of the same cottage as Amanda and Meredith. He had a reputation for being a bit of a drifter, someone who would crash parties and occasionally commit minor break-ins to support himself. In the weeks leading up to the murder, his criminal behavior had escalated. He had been identified as the perpetrator of a break-in at a lawyer's office, where he was found with a stolen laptop and a large knife. Just days before the murder, he had broken into a nursery school and was found by the owner, again in possession of a knife. He was the ghost in the machine, the known criminal whose definitive, irrefutable presence at the scene of the crime would be both the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case and the one most stubbornly ignored by the prosecution in their relentless pursuit of a different, more sensational story. The stage was set on the night of November 1, 2007. It was the festival of Ogni Santi, or All Saints' Day, a national holiday in Italy. The city was quiet. Meredith spent the evening with her English friends, a perfectly ordinary night. They had pizza and apple crumble at a friend's apartment, then watched the film The Notebook. Around 9 p.m. she said her goodbyes and began the short walk home alone, a solitary figure moving through the quiet lamplit streets of Perugia. That was the last time her friends would see her alive. Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito, meanwhile, spent the night at his apartment. They later told police a simple, mundane story. They had smoked marijuana, watched the whimsical French film Amélie, used his computer, and made love. Their alibi was each other. They were together, lost in their own world. The next morning, that world intruded with brutal force. Amanda woke up at Raphael's place and walked back to the cottage on Via della Pergola around 10:30 a.m., planning to take a shower and grab a mop to help clean up a small leak at his place. What she found, she would later say, was immediately unsettling. The front door, which should have been locked, was wide open. She walked inside, calling out for her roommates, but heard nothing. She noticed drops of blood in the bathroom she shared with Meredith, a detail that was strange, but not immediately terrifying. She assumed one of her roommates had a nosebleed or had cut themselves. She showered, and it was only then, as she was getting dressed, that she saw things that truly set off alarm bells. A window in her Italian roommate Filomena's bedroom was shattered, with glass littering the floor below, and Meredith's door was locked, which was highly unusual. She tried to call Meredith, but there was no answer. A growing sense of dread, the kind that prickles at the back of your neck, began to creep in. She went back to Raphael's apartment, confused and scared. She told him what she had seen: the open door, the blood, the broken window, the locked bedroom. He tried to call Meredith on her 2 phones as well, but one was switched off and the other went straight to voicemail. It was Raphael who suggested calling the police. He first called his sister, who was a member of the Carabinieri, Italy's national gendarmerie. Following her advice, he then called the Carabinieri emergency number, 112, to report the strange circumstances and a possible break-in. But before the Carabinieri could arrive, another branch of law enforcement showed up purely by chance, in a twist of fate that would have profound consequences. 2 officers from the Polizia Postale, the Postal and Communications Police, arrived at the cottage. They were there for a completely unrelated reason. 2 burner phones had been found discarded in a nearby garden, and a quick check had revealed they were registered to Meredith Kercher. When they arrived, they found Amanda and Raphael waiting outside, looking visibly distressed. After a brief and confusing conversation, the officers, along with Amanda, Raphael, and some of the downstairs neighbors, tried to force Meredith's locked door. It wouldn't budge. One of the postal police officers eventually kicked it in. The scene inside was the beginning of the nightmare. The room was dark, the shutters closed. On the floor, beneath a blood-soaked duvet, was a human foot. The room was in disarray, and there was blood, so much blood. Meredith Kercher was dead. The initial response from law enforcement was chaotic, a far cry from the meticulous, controlled process one sees in crime dramas. The crime scene, that sacred space from which truth is meant to be carefully excavated, was immediately and irrevocably compromised. Dozens of people, police officers from multiple agencies, paramedics, the coroner, the prosecutor, traipsed in and out for hours. Evidence was trampled, moved, and overlooked. The focus was not on careful preservation, but on the immediate, shocking horror of the scene. And in that chaos, suspicion, like a magnetic force, began to coagulate around the 2 young lovers who had been the first to raise the alarm: the odd American girl and her quiet Italian boyfriend. The investigation was led by Giuliano Mignini, a public prosecutor, or publico ministero, with a reputation for a certain kind of imaginative, almost literary approach to criminal justice. He was a man known for seeing grand conspiracies and hidden narratives where others saw simple, brutal facts. His name was already famous in Italy for his central role in the long-running, convoluted investigation into the Monster of Florence, a serial killer case from the 1970s and 80s. Mignini had pursued a bizarre and ultimately discredited theory that the killings were linked to a satanic cult, a powerful cabal that performed human sacrifices. This predisposition for baroque, complex theories of ritualistic evil would prove to be the single most influential factor in the direction the Meredith Kercher investigation would take. When Mignini arrived at the cottage on Via della Pergola, he surveyed the scene, but he did not just see a murder. He saw a performance. He saw a ritual. The initial focus of his investigation fell almost immediately on Amanda and Raphael's behavior. To the Italian investigators, their actions in the hours and days after the discovery were not just strange. They were damning. They were seen kissing and cuddling outside the crime scene as the police conducted their work. At the police station, the questora, during the long, grueling hours of waiting to be interviewed, Amanda was seen doing stretches and even a cartwheel in the hallway. In the context of American culture, this behavior might be interpreted as the awkward, inappropriate, but ultimately harmless response of a shocked and emotionally immature young person, someone trying to release an unbearable tide of nervous energy and anxiety. But through the prism of Italian cultural expectations, where public grief is expected to be somber, dignified, and demonstrative, her behavior was seen as something else entirely. It was perceived as cold, detached, unemotional, even psychopathic. It was the first and perhaps most critical cultural misreading in a case that would be defined by them. She did not perform grief in the way they expected, and for that she was immediately judged. Her every action was interpreted through a lens of guilt. This judgment colored everything that followed, especially the interrogations. Over the next 4 days, Amanda and Raphael were questioned relentlessly. These were not the structured, rights-oriented interviews an American would expect. Amanda was questioned for hours on end, over multiple sessions, sometimes for more than 10 hours at a stretch, often through the night. She had no lawyer present. The translator provided was a police employee, not a professional, independent interpreter. This interpreter would later testify that her translations were often summaries of what was said, not a direct, word-for-word translation. Amanda was 20 years old, in a foreign country, operating in a language she was still learning, suffering from acute stress and sleep deprivation, and facing immense psychological pressure from a large group of male officers. The questions came in a torrent of accusations and demands. The police, already convinced of her guilt based on her strange behavior, employed tactics designed to break her down. They told her she had amnesia, that she was suffering from trauma, and had blocked out the memory of the murder. They shouted at her, called her a liar, slapped her on the back of the head. They insisted they had physical proof that she was at the cottage during the murder. They lied, telling her that Raphael had cracked and had turned against her, confessing that she had left his apartment on the night of the crime. This is a classic interrogation technique, designed to isolate and panic a suspect. For Amanda, it worked. On the night of November 5th, after more than 50 hours of intermittent interrogation, she broke. Exhausted, terrified, and utterly confused, her grip on reality slipping, she signed 2 statements that were written for her in Italian. In them, she implicated Patrick Lumumba, the Congolese owner of La Chic, a local bar where she had a part-time job. She claimed she had a vision or a dream of being at the cottage and hearing Meredith scream, and that she saw Patrick in Meredith's room. It was a classic coerced internalized false confession, a phenomenon where an innocent person, under extreme duress, comes to believe they might have been involved in a crime they didn't commit. It was a desperate attempt by a terrified young woman to give the police the story they so clearly wanted, just so the pressure would stop. It was a confession she tried to recant in a handwritten note just a few hours later, stating she was confused, had been pressured, and wasn't sure if her visions were real. But it was too late. For Mignini and the investigators, this was the cornerstone of their case. They had their confession. Based on this coerced statement, on November 6th, Amanda Knox, Raphael Solicito, and Patrick Lumumba were arrested and charged with murder and sexual assault. The arrests were a media sensation. Mignini presented his theory to the ravenous press. This was not a simple burglary gone wrong. This was a satanic erotic ritual. He painted a lurid picture of Amanda as a manipulative, diabolical seductress who had dragged her willing boyfriend, Raphael, and her boss Patrick into a violent sex game that ended with Meredith's ritualistic murder, the media, both in Italy and, most voraciously, in the UK, ran with it. The nickname Foxy Knoxy was weaponized, splashed across headlines worldwide. She was no longer Amanda Knox, the student from Seattle. She was a femme fatale, a cold-blooded killer hiding behind an angelic face. Patrick Lumumba was completely innocent. He had a rock-solid alibi, having been seen by multiple witnesses working at his bar all night long. He was released after 2 weeks in prison, but his life and reputation in Perugia were shattered. His wrongful arrest, based entirely on a coerced and immediately recanted statement, was the first clear, objective sign of the investigation's profound and dangerous failings. It was a glaring warning that went unheeded. With Lumumba cleared, the prosecution needed a third person to fit their group assault theory, and that is when Rudy Guide reappeared. On November 20th, nearly 3 weeks after the murder, forensic investigators announced a major breakthrough. A bloody handprint found on a pillowcase under Meredith's body was a match for Rudy Guide. His DNA was also found on and inside Meredith's body, on her purse, and on the toilet paper in the bathroom. This was the moment the case should have pivoted 180 degrees. Here was a known burglar with a history of carrying a knife, whose DNA and bloody print were all over the crime scene and the victim. The simplest explanation, Occam's razor, was that Guide had broken in through the window of Philomena's room, been confronted by Meredith, and had sexually assaulted and murdered her. The broken window, previously dismissed by the prosecution as a staged break-in designed to mislead police, now made perfect sense. But Mignini and the investigators were too deeply invested in their original narrative. Instead of reassessing their case in the face of this overwhelming new evidence, they simply stretched their theory to fit the new, inconvenient fact. Guide was not a lone killer. He was the third accomplice. The narrative now became that Amanda, Raphael, and Rudy Guide had all been at the cottage, engaged in a three-way, drug-fueled orgy that culminated in murder. Guide, who had fled to Germany after the murder, was arrested and extradited. He admitted to being at the cottage, but his story shifted multiple times. He consistently maintained that Amanda and Raphael were involved, claiming he was in the bathroom when he heard Meredith scream. He had an obvious, powerful motive to lie, to deflect blame from himself, and implicate the two people the police and the entire world were already convinced were guilty. With Guide in custody and their three-person narrative solidified, the prosecution turned to finding the forensic evidence that would tie Amanda and Raphael to the room where Meredith died. What they produced would become some of the most contested and controversial forensic evidence in modern legal history. The first key piece was a large kitchen knife, 8.5 inches long, found in a cutlery drawer at Raphael's apartment. The prosecution claimed this was the murder weapon. On its handle, they found Amanda's DNA, an unsurprising discovery, as she frequently cooked and ate at her boyfriend's apartment. The controversy was on the blade. After extensive testing, a forensic team, led by Dr. Patrizia Stefanoni, claimed to have found a tiny trace amount of Meredith Kercher's DNA on the very tip of the blade. The sample was so small it could not be retested, a critical violation of international forensic protocol. It was what is known as low copy number, or LCN, DNA evidence, a technique so sensitive it can pick up minuscule traces of DNA that may have been transferred innocently. For instance, if Amanda had touched Meredith's hand days earlier and then used the knife, but also so prone to contamination and error, that many jurisdictions, including the UK, treat it with extreme caution. The defense argued that the DNA was either a statistical anomaly or, more likely, the result of contamination in the lab. Furthermore, the knife itself was inconsistent with the deep stab wounds on Meredith's neck, and it did not match a bloody imprint of a knife left on the bedsheet at the crime scene. The second piece of crucial evidence was a bra clasp belonging to Meredith that was collected from the floor of her bedroom, but it wasn't collected on the first day or even the first week. In a stunning display of investigative incompetence, it was found 46 days after the murder, long after the crime scene had been unsealed and compromised. Investigators testified that during the initial chaotic search, the clasp had been kicked around the room by multiple people. On this tiny piece of metal, which had been lying on a contaminated floor for over 6 weeks, Dr. Stefanoni's team claimed to have found Rafael Solicito's DNA. The defense argued that this was a textbook case of evidence contamination. The idea that his DNA could have survived on that clasp for 46 days, through all the activity in the room, and be from the night of the crime, was, they argued, a forensic fantasy. There was no other trace of Rafael, no hair, no fiber, no sweat, no fingerprints anywhere in the room where Meredith was murdered. The entire physical case against him rested on this one, highly suspect bra clasp. And that was it. The sum total of the physical evidence linking Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito to the brutal murder was a non-retestable trace of DNA on a knife that didn't match the wounds, and DNA on a bra clasp collected from a contaminated crime scene 46 days late. There were no fingerprints from either of them in the room. No hair, no fibers, no shoe prints, nothing in a room that should have been saturated with their DNA had they participated in such a violent, bloody struggle. The room was, however, filled with the DNA of Rudy Guide. But in the eyes of the prosecution and much of the public, the narrative was stronger than the facts. The story of Foxy Knoxy and her submissive lover was more compelling than the mundane reality of a lone burglar committing a violent crime. And so, armed with a lurid story and 2 pieces of highly contested DNA evidence, the prosecution proceeded to trial. Before Amanda and Rafael faced their jury, Rudy Guide opted for a separate fast-track trial in October of 2008. This is a procedure in the Italian system that allows for a quicker trial with a reduced sentence in exchange for the defendant giving up certain rights. Guide was tried by a single judge based on the evidence on file, without live witness testimony. The judge found him guilty of sexual assault and murder and sentenced him to 30 years in prison, which was later reduced to 16 years on appeal. Crucially, in the judge's written motivation for the verdict, he stated that he believed Guide had not acted alone, speculating that he had held Meredith's arms while others stabbed her. This judicial opinion, though not a binding finding of fact, bolstered the prosecution's theory and set a dangerous, prejudicial precedent for the upcoming trial of Knox and Solicito. That trial began in January 2009, more than a year after their arrests. The Italian court system is fundamentally different from the American adversarial system. It's often described as an inquisitorial system, where the judges in this case, a panel of 2 professional judges and 6 lay jurors, known as the Court of Assizes, play a more active role in investigating the facts of the case. The trial was a global spectacle. The international media descended on Perugia, transforming the small medieval city into a chaotic hub of reporters, satellite trucks, and camera crews. The prosecution, led by Giuliano Mignini, presented its case not as a chain of evidence, but as a dramatic performance. He reenacted the murder for the court, his voice rising with theatrical fervor as he described his theory. The case was built on character assassination. Amanda's diary, written while she was in prison, was read aloud in court. Witnesses were called to testify about her supposed promiscuity. Her cartwheel at the police station was presented as evidence of her guilt. The foxy Knoxy persona, created by the media, was now being prosecuted as fact. The defense, led by Luciano Girga and Carlo Dalla Vedova for Amanda, and Giulia Bongiorno for Raphael, fought back, meticulously deconstructing the prosecution's forensic case. They brought in their own experts, who testified that the DNA evidence was unreliable and likely the product of contamination. They highlighted the dozens of procedural errors made by the police during the investigation and the collection of evidence. They pointed, again and again, to Rudy Guide as the obvious lone killer, but they were fighting against a tidal wave of public opinion and a deeply entrenched narrative. After 11 months of testimony and media circus, the court retired to consider its verdict. On December 5, 2009, the verdict was read: guilty. Amanda Knox was sentenced to 26 years in prison. Raphael Solicito was sentenced to 25 years. The camera flashes erupted. Amanda collapsed in tears, crying out, "No, no." She had been in an Italian prison for over 2 years, and now she was facing the prospect of spending the rest of her youth and more behind bars for a crime she insisted she did not commit. But in the Italian system, a conviction is not the end of the road. There is an automatic right to appeal, which is essentially a full second trial where new evidence can be considered. The first appeal began in late 2010. This time, the defense's strategy focused almost entirely on a single critical point: the forensic evidence. Their key demand was for an independent, court-appointed review of the 2 crucial DNA samples, the knife and the bra clasp. The court, led by a new judge, Claudio Pertillo-Hellman, agreed. 2 independent experts from Rome's prestigious Sapienza University, Carla Vecchiotti and Stefano Conti, were appointed to re-examine the forensic findings from the ground up. Their report, delivered in the summer of 2011, was an absolute bombshell. It was a methodical, systematic, and utterly devastating indictment of the original forensic investigation. The experts concluded that the original scientific police had made a litany of glaring errors, from wearing dirty gloves to failing to follow basic anti-contamination protocols that were standard practice across Europe. They found that the amount of Meredith's DNA supposedly on the knife was so low that it was scientifically unreliable and could not be confirmed. Regarding the bra clasp, they confirmed it had been collected 46 days late from a contaminated scene and stated that the DNA evidence on it was unreliable and likely contaminated during collection. In short, the entire forensic foundation of the prosecution's case had not just crumbled, it had been pulverized by an independent, court-sanctioned review. The appeal trial turned into a battle of experts, but the damage to the prosecution's case was done. The independent review had exposed the stunning flaws and sensational failures in the investigation. On October 3, 2011, after 4 years in prison, Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito stood in court to hear the verdict of their appeal. The court found them not guilty. The original conviction was overturned. They were free. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Amanda once again broke down, but this time her sobs were of overwhelming relief. A few hours later, She was driven from Capon prison to Rome's airport and boarded a flight back to Seattle, a free woman. It seemed the nightmare was finally, blessedly over. But the labyrinth of the Italian justice system had one more cruel twist. The prosecution appealed the acquittal to Italy's highest court, the Court of Cassation. This court doesn't re-examine evidence, but rather checks to see if the lower court applied the law correctly, and whether its logic was sound. In a stunning, almost incomprehensible decision in March 2013, the Court of Cassation threw out the acquittal. They didn't declare Amanda and Raphael guilty, but they annulled the innocent verdict, ruling that the appellate court in Perugia had demonstrated multiple instances of deficiencies, contradictions, and illogicality in its reasoning. They argued the appeal court had been too dismissive of certain circumstantial evidence and had failed to consider the prosecution's case as a whole. They ordered a brand new appeal trial to be held in a different city, Florence. Amanda, now back in the United States, attempting to rebuild her life, was to be tried again for a murder she had already been convicted of and then acquitted of. She rightly refused to return to Italy and was tried in absentia. The Florence court, in 2014, reconvicted them both. It was a bewildering decision that seemed to ignore the independent expert testimony and instead relied on a new, highly technical argument about an untested DNA trace on the knife. Amanda was once again a convicted felon in Italy, facing a 28.5-year sentence if she ever set foot in the country. It felt like a legal twilight zone, a case that would never end, a wound that would never be allowed to heal. There was only one place left to go, one final, definitive appeal to the Court of Cassation. This was the last word, the final judgment. In March of 2015, 7.5 years after Meredith Kercher's death, the highest court in Italy convened to make its definitive ruling. This time, the judges did not just review the process, they reviewed the very substance of the case file, and their conclusion was absolute and unequivocal. They definitively and finally acquitted Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito. A few months later, they released their official written explanation, a 52-page document that served as a powerful and damning indictment of the entire investigation and prosecution. The judges wrote of stunning flaws in the investigation, a complete lack of a body of evidence, and sensational failures in investigative activity. They noted the absolute lack of biological traces of Knox or Solicito in the room where Meredith was murdered. The court concluded that Amanda and Raphael had been subjected to a sudden, explosive, and unstoppable media pressure that had compromised the entire process. The verdict was not just not guilty, it was acquitted for not having committed the fact. It was the strongest possible declaration of innocence under Italian law. The nightmare was, finally, truly over. So what are we left with when the media moves on, when the prison gates open, and the final gavel falls? We are left with the anatomy of this case, a dissection of what went so horribly wrong. The tragic, brutal murder of Meredith Kercher, a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her, was a crime that demanded clear, meticulous, and unbiased justice. Instead, it triggered a systemic failure that became a global cautionary tale. The anatomy of this failure is a collision of justice systems, a catastrophic pileup of cultural misunderstanding, prosecutorial bias, and profoundly flawed science. First, there was the profound and devastating cultural misunderstanding. Amanda Knox's behavior, her way of processing shock and fear, was alien to her Italian interrogators, and later, to much of the Italian public. her cartwheel, her kissing her boyfriend, her perceived lack of performative grief, these were not clues to a crime, but cultural artifacts that were misinterpreted through a narrow and unforgiving lens as evidence of a guilty conscience. She was a quirky, somewhat naive American girl judged against the standards of a more traditional and formal European culture, and in that vast gap of understanding, a monster was created for the tabloids. Second, this case is a chilling study in the power of prosecutorial tunnel vision. From the very beginning, Giuliano Mignini, influenced by his past preoccupations with satanic cults, crafted a Baroque narrative of a sex ritual gone wrong. This story was more fiction than fact, more Gothic novel than police report. When overwhelming evidence emerged that contradicted this narrative, like Patrick Lumumba's ironclad alibi, or the mountain of forensic evidence pointing solely and directly to Rudy Guide, the narrative was not abandoned. It was simply twisted and stretched to accommodate the inconvenient facts. The investigation was not a search for the truth, but a stubborn, relentless search for evidence to fit a preconceived theory of guilt. Third, we witnessed the complete breakdown of forensic science as a tool for justice. In a case with almost no motive and no credible confession, the physical evidence should have been paramount. Instead, the two linchpins of the prosecution's case, the knife and the bra clasp, were exposed by independent experts as products of shoddy collection, questionable analysis, and a failure to adhere to the most basic scientific protocols. Science, which should have provided clarity, was instead used to add a veneer of false certainty to a baseless accusation. Finally, the stark differences in the legal systems created a legal vortex. The long pretrial detention, the nature of the psychologically coercive interrogations without a lawyer, and the bewildering process of appeals, acquittals, and retrials are all features of the Italian system that, while not inherently unjust, contributed to this protracted 8-year ordeal. An American accustomed to the Miranda rights and the principle of double jeopardy found herself adrift in a system she could not navigate, where a declaration of innocence was not necessarily the end of the story. Rudy Guide, the only person whose DNA and bloody fingerprints were found all over the crime scene, was granted early release from prison in 2021 after serving 13 years of his sentence. Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito are free, their names legally and absolutely cleared, but they will forever carry the scars of the years they lost and the public condemnation they endured. And the family of Meredith Kercher, who have conducted themselves with immense dignity throughout this unimaginable ordeal, are left with the hollow reality that while one man was convicted, the official pursuit of a sensationalist fantasy allowed the focus to stray so far from the simple, brutal truth of what happened to their daughter in that room on Via della Pergola. In the end, Amanda Knox was not tried for a crime, but for a character she never was, in a language she barely spoke, under a system she could not comprehend, a ghost created in the chasm between two worlds, a warning that the most dangerous evidence of all is the certainty of our own perception. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.